Right, welcome to my diary on the Subharmonicon day 1. It's day 1 because today I received in the post my Subharmonicon. I didn't buy it brand new, I got it used, but it's pretty much in new condition. And it's in its original box and packaging. And if you've never owned a Moog product and unboxed it, then you really are missing out on something, because forget about what you might think about Moog the company or their products or the cost of their products. They know how to do boxes really well. It's just a work of art, this box. It's not just a box, it's printed beautifully on the outside and the inside, and then once you open it up you see a really beautifully laid out nice user manual. So many synth manufacturers don't bother with user manuals these days. Go and look it up online. Here we've got a proper user manual, something you can just sit down and read, and I really like that. And then you've got these little templates for presets for this particular synth, really nicely printed. You've got a colourful little registration card, and then I think with every Moog product you get this little folded up wall poster that shows their current product catalogue on it. It's just those little tiny things that sort of like add up to a really nice experience. It makes you really feel good about the fact that you've just received your Moog Subharmonicon. Right, so it's day 2, and I thought what I'd do with the Subharmonicon is sort of like get into it really gently, and just for this first day kind of ignore the sub-oscillator harmonic capabilities and ignore the polyrhythm sequencing capabilities, and just try playing it as a regular monosynth, or in fact as a duophonic synth, because if you control it via CV and gate, you've actually got access to the pitch of both of the VCOs independently, so you can play it duophonically. So that's what I just thought I'd have a go at, because obviously we've got a wonderful sounding Moog filter here, we've got a couple of really lovely, hopefully lovely sounding oscillators, and loads of sub-oscillators as well, and it works quite well. I mean, I'm saying quite well. The biggest downside with it, if you would just want to play it from a MIDI keyboard or via CV and gate, the biggest downside are the envelope generators. Now we've got 2 of them, a dedicated filter envelope and a dedicated amplitude envelope, but you'll see that they're not full ADSRs. They're just, well, what they've got written here, attack and decay. But actually the decay is not decay, it's actually release, because there is a sort of hardwired, you can't do anything about it, full sustain with these envelopes. 100% sustain. Now you don't notice the sustain when you're playing it via a sequencer, because sequencers just sort of like, momentarily give you a gate. It's a very short gate, and so these do end up acting like decays. But when you're playing it from a keyboard, you hold down your key, this decay portion is not going to do anything until you release the key. So it does limit the kinds of sounds that you can get out of this synth if you just play it from a keyboard. You know, if you want some real nice sort of like high resonance, stabby bass sounds, stuff like that, it's difficult with this because you're only going to get that drop off of the filter, that stabby sound, when you release the key, which means you're going to then have to have a long amplitude release on your amplitude envelope as well. It just doesn't work the way you might want it to work, put it that way. It's a bit limiting. It's just a shame that they didn't have just a little switch here on the front which allowed you to disable the sustain portion of these envelopes. It'd be very, very simple for them to have done that, but they didn't do it. I appreciate that I'm not using this instrument for its intended purpose, which is sequencers, but you know, it does have two lovely VCOs, it has a lovely filter. Why not use it from a keyboard? It is doable, and with the with the fact that you've got these 4 sub oscillators in total, which is an awful lot, means that you can get some really quite sort of like cool organ kind of sounds out of it. You know, using the sub oscillators to pick out different octave levels. So it has got its purpose. You know, it has got its uses. As a sort of a standalone synth controlled by a MIDI keyboard or whatever, but it's not quite what I hoped it would be. Right, end of day 3. Frustrating, actually. Not very happy. On day one, I went on about this wonderful manual and how beautifully printed it was and glorious, and how it's great to have it printed so you could sit down and read it. And then what have I done? I've just not bothered to read it, and that was a mistake. I just thought I would just jump straight in and start creating some polyrhythms. Now, admittedly, I mean, I've done quite a lot of kind of polyrhythm kind of music in the past, and generally, well, always the way that I achieve that is what I would consider the normal way, which is you have more than one sequencer running at the same tempo, but you change the number of steps, and that gives you some wonderful polyrhythms. It's not how this works at all. The way this works is you've got two fixed length sequences, and the way that you get your polyrhythms is to change the speed of those sequences compared to each other, in contrast to each other, and you change the speed of them with these little tiny little rhythm controls here. Now, because I didn't read the manual and because I just thought I knew what I would be doing here, I kind of set things to sort of like the middle, set the tempo to somewhere in the middle, set these guys in the middle, and I should just be able to adjust a few things and get some interesting polyrhythms going, and I couldn't get anything where one sequence was kind of a subdivision that made any sense of the other sequence. And it all comes down to these subdivisions and understanding them, because a tempo up here in the middle somewhere is running at a really quite high clock rate. To get some decent results, you need to be turning the tempo really quite slow, then turning up one of these rhythms right to its maximum, and that's going to give you the clock rate. And then you kind of need to get your clock rate to the fastest you'll ever need it to be, like 16ths or whatever it is that you need for your particular sequence. And then once you've got that in place, then go and create subdivisions of it, and you'll find it an awful lot easier. It's easier for me to sort of demonstrate what I'm talking about rather than just talk to you about it, but I'll do that in a second. So that's been very, very frustrating. I needed to read the manual, I needed to understand the way to really work with the synth, and I didn't bother. Right, this is day 4 and it's been a really good day. It's really clicked. I have really clicked with this instrument. It's not just about what I talked about yesterday, which is understanding the subdivisions of tempo and the subdivisions of the sub-oscillator frequencies, and understanding how to get the best out of those, how they work. It's also about understanding and accepting the limitations of this instrument, which are quite severe. You know, your sequences are only 4-note sequences, 4-step sequences, and they're fixed at 4 steps, and that's all you've got. That's quite a serious limitation. And also, you know, because you've got your 2 sequencers and you've got your 2 VCOs, it's very easy to sort of like lull yourself into the idea that they are actually 2 separate synth voices, and they're not. This is at best a duophonic synth. There's 1 filter, 1 cutoff control, 1 resonance control, 1 filter envelope, 1 amp envelope. You know, your sequencers, they will trigger both the oscillators, whatever you've mixed, whatever you've turned up the volume of in terms of sub-oscillators and oscillators. Each of the sequencers will play everything here. It's the sequencers are changing the notes and changing the frequencies independently, but at every step, when a note is triggered, everything is triggered, because there is only 1 filter envelope and 1 amp envelope. And you know, it's really nice to sort of like the idea of having, say, 1 sequence going very, very slowly with you know, a patch that's sort of got like a long attack and a long release, and it sort of like gives you some nice sort of like interesting sort of bass notes, and then you'll play the second sequencer really, you know, a lot faster, some sort of nice little sort of staccato thing going on there. You can't do that with this because you have only got 1 filter envelope, 1 amplifier envelope, and 1 filter. So, you know, there are some sort of serious limitations to this. Yes, you've got patch points here, and you can extend that, and I'll talk about that in a future day when I get on to trying to patch it. But as a standalone instrument, it is quite limiting. But once you kind of get around that and you accept it, I've really found it absolutely, completely inspiring. I've just been creating loads and loads of lovely little sequences, you know, not complete songs, but little sort of like segments of songs. And the song that's sort of playing in the background now, this is today's, you know, the fruits of my labours today. It's kind of starting to all click, and I'm really, really actually enjoying this a lot. Right, so it's day 5, and it's time to mention a bug, unfortunately. Now, I've mentioned before, I keep going on about it, I'm sorry about that, but it is really important to understand that this synthesizer doesn't have 2 independent voices that you can sequence. It's got 1 single voice. You can change the pitches of the VCOs independently, but you have 1 synth voice. You have 1 filter envelope, 1 amplitude envelope. It's at best a duophonic synth. And what that means, you know, the reality of that is that whichever one of these sequences happens to be moving onto a step, that action will cause the envelopes to trigger. So if you've got a really slow sequence going on sequence number 1, and you've got a fast sequence going on sequence number 2, you're going to hear both VCOs being triggered at that faster rate. And it is limiting. It's limiting to the kind of sounds that you can get out of the synth. Now, there is, thankfully, a way of getting around this using the patch bay here. And what you can do is you can choose either sequencer 1 or sequencer 2 and say, I only want that sequencer to trigger the envelopes. And the way you do that is I'm going to choose sequencer number 1. There's a sequencer number 1 clock output here. That's actually giving me the tempo, whatever it is at any point in time, the tempo of sequencer number 1 as a clock signal. And then I can pass that in, patch it in to this trigger input here. So I'm overriding the default behavior. So now with this cable patched like this, it's only going to be when sequencer number 1 goes through its steps do the envelopes get triggered. However, there's a bug with it, and the bug is that the sequencer 1 and sequencer 2 clock outputs are not accurate. They're out by 1 clock cycle, and I'll try and demonstrate to you now exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so I've got 2 sequences here, one running very fast and the other much slower. And as I said before, the envelopes are going to be triggered anytime either of these sequences is moving on to its next step. You can hear it better if I turn down the decays. So what if I want the second sequence to be triggering the envelopes on its own? Well, my little patch cable is already in place, as you can see. So all I need to do is press this little EG button, turn it off, and that should do the trick. So now the envelopes are triggering just when the second sequence moves from one step to the next. But I don't know whether you can notice, but there is actually a delay between moving to the step and you hearing the effect. And the only way really to get around this issue is to introduce long attacks and long decays, and you're kind of blurring the problem then. But if you want short stabby sequences, then this really is quite a big problem. So what I'm going to do for you now is play it again, first with the metronome running so you can see exactly what I'm talking about in terms of timing, and then play it with the Subharmonicon audio as well. So there, hopefully you've seen the bug, and it's just a bug. I mean, it should be fixable in firmware. You'd hope it will be fixable in firmware. I'm sure it is. And so, fair enough, what's the big deal? But the only big deal really is that the Subharmonicon was released, what, 9 months ago now? At the time I'm doing this video, I think it was 9 months ago. And as far as I can tell from the Moog website, there hasn't been a firmware update released for this synth since it first launched. So I really don't know when they're going to fix this issue. I just think it's a bit sad because this is such a basic bug. They should have found it when they were testing, and it should have been fixed before the synth was ever released. It really does limit the extendability of this synth in a way that just shouldn't be there. Right, so today has been MIDI day. I've been basically hooking up the Subharmonicon to my computer, to my DAW Cubase, and controlling it via MIDI, and it's basically synchronizing the clock to my DAW, which for me is really important. Now the track you're hearing in the background here is just a little test of how I can record multiple little sequences on the Subharmonicon and then sort of like put them together and sort of build up a bit more of a complex kind of track from multiple sequences. So that's what you're hearing in the background. It's worked fine. I haven't had any synchronization issues, any clock issues. It's kept timing really well, and I was keen to see that it worked because of the bug that I found yesterday. So it's working really well. Now there's a consequence of hooking this up to your DAW and synchronizing it over MIDI, and that's to do with resets. And there's a little button here called a reset button. I haven't talked about it at all, but I'm going to have to talk about it another day because it is a bit of a topic that does need to be discussed. I can see on social media that there are some people have a problem with resets on their synths. Not a bug, but just a behavioural thing. And we will get onto it another day. But today I'm happy with the way that this works with MIDI. I've got here the little adapter that it comes with. This little cable here gives you a DIN connection. So this is a MIDI into the synth, and there is no MIDI out, which is a bit of a shame because it would be nice to be able to actually capture the sequences that you create and record those, via MIDI notes, so that you can then manipulate them and play them around with them later on. You can't do that with this, but it's working well. So today I've been looking at extending the Subharmonicon because clearly it's a semi-modular synth. It's got all of these patch points here, so as well as sort of patching it from one point to the other, you can hook it up to external gear. Now, although there are a lot of patch points here, I think it's fair to say that about 50% of them relate to the sequencing, clock, timing kind of stuff only, and then the other 50% really relate to the synth voice. And the synth voice is a very, very simple synth voice. 6 of these patch points are going to be purely just to get the audio out of the VCOs and the sub oscillators. There's not that many patch points left for sort of like manipulating and changing the synth voice itself. So hooking up to external gear is definitely a logical thing to do, and I think that Moog definitely had in mind their Mother 32 and their DFAM when they came up with this particular instrument, and I think that it complements those two other instruments very, very well. Now, I don't have a Mother 32 and I don't have a DFAM, so I've been looking to hook it up to Eurorack Gear, and I'll show you now the choices that I made and the gear that I ended up using to extend it and see what I could do with it. So that's what's coming up next. Okay, so here's what I ended up going with. I ended up picking up a couple of these little Moog 60 HP Eurorack cases. They're both used. I think I paid about £50 each for them, which I thought was quite a good deal. They are unpowered. There's no power inside them at all, so you need to power them some other way, and that's what those little black modules are down the left-hand side. They're made by Behringer. I think they're called CP1A. They're really, really cool. Very, very handy to have these modules if you're thinking about buying an unpowered case for your Eurorack stuff. And they're very reasonably priced. I think they're like £50–55 for these little modules, these power modules. Really good. And they don't take up much room. So as you can see, I've basically kind of standardized there on System 100 modules, because although they're quite large, you do get an awful lot of functionality into them, especially the synth voices. So you'll see if we look at the top case, there are two 110 modules on the left hand side. Those are the all-in-one synth voice modules. You get a voltage controlled oscillator, filter and amplifier. Lots of attenuation capability there. They really are very, very good. The only thing they're really lacking is a envelope generator or two. So that's why I've added a 140 module, which gives me 2 envelope generators, and it also gives me an LFO as well. So that's what I've got on the top row, and there was just enough room left on the right hand side to fill it with a Doepfer module. This one is called the A156. It's a dual quantize module. And I thought I would implement that because it'll help me to tune the 2 sequencer modules that I have got in the lower case. So if we look at that lower case, on the left hand side we've got 2 Behringer 182 modules, And then it just happens that I can fit in there this rather large 305 module. I do like this module. It's got a parametric EQ which takes up a lot of space and I don't ever use it. But what it does have, it's got a 4-channel stereo mixer, so I can take the outputs from my 2 synth engines and from the Subharmonicon, which is a mono output, and I can mix those together and come up with a stereo mix. It's also got a dedicated headphone amplifier and output, and it's also got oscillator for tuning your all your other oscillators in your rig, which is really important because we need to tune the 2 VCOs on the Subharmonicon and the 2 VCOs in these 110 modules. So that's what I ended up coming up with. It all fits nicely in those little cases, which is very important for me. And then I was able to pick up one of these little sort of 3 stage rack things from Moog, so that I could put it all together and make it look cool. I mean, obviously it would be great if I had a Mother 32 or a DFAM or both of them or multiple ones, but that's what I've got. So, I mean, really my choices here were to just go with just adding some more voices, so 2 more synth voices and adding some more sequencing capability. These 182 modules, they can either be run as a single sequence up to 16 steps, or they can be run as 2 synchronized sequences up to 8 steps. Right, today let's have a chat about the reset button and why you may or may not want to press it. Now, before I bought a Subharmonicon, I scoured the internet and I was searching through social media, looking at conversations of people who had it, seeing what they thought of it, etc. And there seemed to be a sort of like a consistent theme among a few people at least, which was, look, I had this really fantastic polyrhythm going on, it sounded wonderful. I switch the synth off, I switch it back on again, and I've lost everything and I can't get it back. It doesn't have presets. I thought that wherever you left the knobs is wherever you left the knobs. So why is it that my wonderful polyrhythm has disappeared? And there will be some hardened users and experienced users of this synth that will say, press the reset button. Pressing the reset button is equivalent to switching it off and back on again. If you keep pressing the reset button as you're creating your patch, you won't be disappointed the next time you switch your synth off and then back on again. And that's fine, and that's a solution to avoid disappointment, but it's kind of missing the point. And the point is that this synth is capable of creating some really fascinating sort of like polyrhythmic sounds that maybe it's not meant to do so, because if pressing the reset button or switching it off and on again destroys those polyrhythms, then maybe you shouldn't be allowed to create them in the first place. I don't know. Anyway, I'm now going to show you, or attempt to show you, what I mean, what's going on with this reset button, and why, as I said at the beginning, you may or may not want to press it. Okay, so I've got two sequences running. They're playing with different rhythm controls, but they're both turned fully down, so they'll be at the same speed, and they sound like this. I've got a little bit of reverb and delay playing in the background. So what we can do while the sequence is running is just press the play button again to pause it, and then when we press it, it carries on exactly where it left off. If we want to reset the sequences, that's bring them back to step one and also reset their clock cycles, then we can do that by just pressing this little reset button here. It brings everything back to step number one, and then we can carry on. Now, the reason why the reset button is a bane to some people is because by playing around with these controls here, you can actually introduce a timing difference, a delay, a lag between the two sequences. You can make them sort of unsynchronized. At the moment they're synchronized, they're playing exactly at the same time as well as at the same speed. But what if I was to speed up the second sequence and then slow it back down again? Now they're no longer synchronized in terms of the steps that they're playing. They're still synchronized in terms of the speed, but not the steps. So this now sounds subtly different to the sequence I was playing at the beginning. Again, we can pause it, we can continue, it carries on exactly where it left off. But if we were to press the reset button, we would lose this delay, this gap between the two sequences. Another way we can get these two sequences out of sync with each other is by playing with the speed of these rhythm controls. So if I speed this one up and then slow it back down to where it was before, they're both running at the same speed, but we've introduced a lag, a kind of delay in timing between the two. Let's have another go. It's a much shorter delay this time. It's like playing roulette. Let's have another go. And these little delays that we can introduce can sound really interesting when we actually change the speed of one sequence compared to the other one. So let's change the speed of sequence number 2. Let's double its speed. Let's try again. That's now exactly in sync. Let's have another go. I like this one. So this sounds cool because we've introduced a slight delay between the clock cycles of the two sequences, and we'll lose that delay if we press the reset button or switch the unit off and back on again. Right, we've reached day 9, and you might have noticed, you might not have noticed, but I haven't really mentioned the sub-oscillators and subharmonics. I certainly, if I've mentioned them, I haven't enthused over them, and I haven't really shown you any examples of me using them. And this is something I'm going to definitely cover when I do a conclusion to this whole video, because it needs talking about. But you know, there's two aspects to this Subharmonicon. There are the polyrhythm capabilities, the two sequences, the mathematical subdividing of time. That's what's going on over here to create these polyrhythms. And then there's the mathematical subdividing of frequencies, which is how you can basically detune your sub-oscillators below the original oscillator pitch. And those two things combined are, they're steeped in history, in synthesizer history. There's a very interesting little sort of like introduction to the Subharmonicon in the user manual of this synth that tells you about all this history, and that's brilliant, fantastic. But at the end of the day, when I look at this synth, I see a duophonic synth with 2 small sequencers and 4 sub-oscillators. I mean, that's how I look at it. Right, so I'm not really trying to, what I'm trying to say is I'm not trying to go down memory lane and recreate some fascinating historic concept. I'm interested in making music. And what I find with these subharmonics of these sub-oscillators is that they're very hit and miss. I mean, at the end of the day, when it comes to the sequences and setting the timings of them, it can be hit and miss. If you have no clue what you're doing, you just turn knobs and see what happens, then fine. But when I go about trying to make music on a synthesizer or any instrument, I kind of have an idea of what I want to do. I'm not completely blank and just fumbling around in the dark. I've got an idea. I've got an idea of a sequence that I want to dial into my instrument, so that's what I end up doing. And there might be a little bit of sort of trial and error afterwards, but I generally have a good idea, and certainly I have a good idea about the frequencies, about the pitches that I want to have in my sequence. And what I find with the Subharmonics capability in this synth is it really is something you can't predict. You end up turning a knob and finding it either works or it doesn't work. It's either in tune or it's out of tune, and at the end of the day, I don't like out of tune, right? And I'm going to piss some people off by what I'm saying here, because we're all different, and we all have a different view on synthesis and a different reason for being into it in the first place, and we want a different outcome. But at the end of the day, I don't want to sit down with an instrument and create weird out of tune things and go, yeah, that's really cool. I actually want to create and record music. So maybe I'm not the right person to be actually kind of looking at this synth at all in the first place. So I'm looking at it from a very kind of traditional, how can this fit into my sequencer, DAW, synthesizer, electronic keyboard, environment that I have, rather than looking at it as an isolated, gorgeous representation of historic, synthesis methods or whatever. So at the end of the day, the Subharmonics kind of thing ends up being hit and miss. It is hit and miss, and you hear of other YouTube reviewers talking about it and saying they had a lucky accident and suddenly something beautiful comes out of something horrible. And I'm sure if you fiddle around and you want those kind of happy accidents, you're going to get them. But I'm not interested in happy accidents. I'm not interested in accidents at all. I have an idea of what I want and I dial it in, and that's what I want. So I'm going to try in this next segment to show you where I'm coming from and where these sort of like out of tuneness just turns me off. Alright, I mean, I appreciate that I have my own views and I want certain things out of an instrument that maybe other people don't want. So please bear all that in mind. Take it all with a pinch of salt. This is just purely my views on using this synth. Okay, so before we dive into how the Subharmonics aren't really working for me, let's just recap on what they are. If I just hold down this EG button until it flashes, what that does is it kind of bypasses the envelopes and goes to full sustain mode. It's kind of like a drone mode. So now if I turn up an oscillator, you'll hear it all the time. So that is VCO number 1, and let's turn up sub oscillator number 1. It's exactly the same pitch, and that's because we have got this control here to provide these mathematical subdivisions of frequency. So as I turn it anti-clockwise, it goes all the way down there. We can't hear the frequencies very well because actually I need to set the VCO to be quite high in its tuning to really hear these. It's almost down at sort of like clicks down there. But those are the subdivisions. So what we can do with these sub oscillators, we can use them like, you know, traditional sub oscillators. We can let's turn up the VCO. We can, you know, detune them down like 1 octave, 2 octaves, 3, and then all the way down. We can use them like that. So if I set off this sequence, we will hear VCO and sub oscillator playing the sequence as a traditional sub oscillator, and that's how I end up using these sub oscillators as traditional sub oscillators. But that in itself is quite kind of staid and a little bit boring. The idea is that not only do you use your sequencer to affect the pitch of the VCO, but you can also use your sequencer to affect or modulate this control here, the frequency, the subdivision frequency of the sub oscillator. And that's where we get into some sort of like, you know, I don't know, unpredictable territory. So if I just keep playing this thing, and then I press this button, which will make the sequencer modulate this control. So this is my first problem with these subharmonics. I mean, you can see the settings of these controls. It's as if this was turned all the way down, and it's just too low. I need to really pitch up quite high my VCO to get any kind of usable sounds out of these subharmonics. I need to really be turning my VCO up here somewhere. And now we've got a far more sort of usable sound from the sub oscillator. But my problem with that is that's really high. There's not that often that I'll create a sequence with you know, frequencies that high. So you've got quite a disparity between VCO frequency and sub oscillator frequency to have anything usable. Now we've got, I think, with this 4th note, doesn't sound very good. It sounds a bit out of tune. It doesn't certainly sound in a scale that I like. So then what do we do about that? Well, we can either just fiddle around with this, and try and get it to match. Now this first note doesn't sound good. Or we can actually change the frequencies of the sequencer steps themselves. But then we're fundamentally changing the sequence that we put in the first place just to get it to sound good. And that's my problem with using the sub oscillators with their subharmonics in the sequencer settings here, is that it's kind of a compromise the whole time. You try to find something that fits, and that might mean actually, fundamentally changing the sequence you put in the first place. And that's just, that will work for many people. It's not a problem for many people, I'm sure. But for me, it's just not the way that I prefer to sort of like compose music. As I said before, I've got a fixed idea in my head about what sequence I want. So it doesn't feel really intuitive to then be trying to fit something to make it work. That's really why I end up I do use the sub-oscillators, I use them a lot, but I tend to have these turned off, and I tend to use them as traditional sub-oscillators to track the frequency of the oscillator, either an octave below or a fifths or whatever it happens to be. That's how I feel that I can use them best. Right, so we've reached day 10, and so far I've been, experimenting using the Subharmonicon in different ways. I started off by just using it as a duophonic synth and playing it from a keyboard, then using it as a little standalone sort of groove box, if you like, sequencer and synth voice all in one, and seeing what I could do with that. I've tried extending it, adding some Eurorack modular gear, which gives me more sequences, gives me more voices, and obviously then I can create some more complicated sounds with it. And I've also tried using it from my DAW, making sure I'm synchronizing that clock so that I can create a little polyrhythm, record the audio from it, then change some parameters, change the notes, just keeping it sort of compatible and in tune, if you like, with what I've already recorded, create some different polyrhythms on top, record those those audio sequences, and then use those as building blocks to put together a song. All of that is kind of working, and it's fine, it's okay. And today what I've been doing is actually what I've enjoyed the most, if I'm honest, which is just really kind of using the Subharmonicon as something to jam along to, a bit like a drum machine, but actually creating a little sequence with it. It's little rhythmic sequences, might be slow, might be fast, it doesn't matter, but getting something going, then very much hands off, leave it to just keep on playing, and then play along with it with a keyboard, and that's, I found, a really good way of coming up with some creative ideas. So that's what I'm going to show you now, a few different jams, totally unprepared. I just sat down with it, got something going and tried. So it's not going to be beautiful music you're hearing next, but I'll just give you an example of the kind of things I've been doing with it today. You know, you can't say anything about any synthesizer these days without upsetting someone. And probably more so about this one than most because, well, really for two reasons. I mean, firstly, it's a Moog, and some people have an unbending, unquestioning loyalty towards this brand, and I can understand why they do. But also because this synthesizer, you know, is embracing some important historic synthesis concepts. You know, concepts that that some people almost consider to be holy, to be honest with you. So to those purists of you out there that are watching, well, you're probably not watching by now, you probably switched off ages ago, but if you're watching hoping for something better in terms of musical examples than I was able to come up with, then I do apologise, because I have to admit I absolutely have not embraced the subharmonic nature of this synthesizer. I just found that it's just not for me, just doesn't fit my way of working. But, you know, that doesn't mean to say it's not going to suit an awful lot of other people. So I do apologise for that. Now, I mean, the reason why I decided to do this whole video in a diary format was because my emotions about this synthesizer, they changed drastically from one day to the next. It really was a bit of a roller coaster ride. I mean, after that first day of total disappointment, having not bothered to read the user manual, which I strongly recommend that you read if you're going to get this synth, because of not doing that and not reading it and not understanding what the hell I was doing, and just, you know, just being pig-headed and assuming that I know what synthesizers do. It was such a disappointing time that I almost put it back in its box and gave up at that point. I really honestly did, and I can understand why some people buy this synth, try it out, get disappointed, and then just end up flogging it. I mean, I can see why. But I did persevere with it. I did read the manual, and apart from the day of discovering that little glitch, the timing bug, apart from that, I just went from one strength to the next. I spent a week or even 10 days just soaring on a cloud of inspiration. It was just amazing. I would just be grinning from ear to ear playing this thing. I just couldn't put it down. It was just amazing. I mean, it sounds fantastic. It's got a Moog filter in it. It's got some lovely oscillators. It's just got a beautiful tone to it. You can push it and get it to be a bit aggressive. It's got some sort of modulation capability with the waveforms, which I haven't mentioned. So it can get a little bit aggressive if you want it to. It can also sound beautifully mellow. And I absolutely loved it. I've just been sort of writing music with it. Now, the fact that you can't get out of here, the MIDI notes for the sequences that you've set up is a real pain. The fact that you can set it up so that, if you press that reset button, you lose everything, would be so much easier to swallow as a problem if you could just sort of like record the MIDI out the back of it and just capture your sequence that you've unexpectedly ended up creating without really realizing it. But you can't do that. So, from my point of view, all I can really do is record the audio, take a photograph of the front of it, and then come back to it and and try and pull it apart later on and figure out what it was that I actually created in terms of the actual note values and time values and stuff like that. But as much as I got really creative with it and absolutely loved the time I had with it, there does come a point, I think there'll come a point for everyone, when you kind of get saturated with it, because the sounds you can get from it are quite limited. It's just a single synth voice. The waveforms available to you are very limited. You've got 4-step sequences. I mean, that's not really very much, You can hear the repeatability of those 4 notes really quite quickly. You've got a low-pass filter. but you don't have anything else going on. You don't have an LFO or high pass filter, or two voices would have been lovely to have. But there is a limit to this synth, and if you keep on with it for long enough, you will reach a saturation point where everything starts to sound a bit too similar. And that's what I got after about a week of really intensively using this synth. And it's at that point that you then turn to, okay, extend it. Let's start extending it, and increase the longevity of it as an instrument. But that for me really had a bit of a negative effect on my idea about this, because I really realised, hooking up to my Eurorack gear, I realised how I had so many other pieces of gear that can do what this can do. Well, not what this can do with its its time and frequency subdivisions, but you can get the same end results with just a couple of Eurorack sequencer modules and a couple of synth voices, and that gets you a very, very long way. And then you've got hardware sequencers, like you've got the Squid from Pioneer, you've got the SQ64 from Korg, Polyens SEQ Sec sequencer. There's actually loads of hardware sequencers out there that are sort of multi-track. They can create some incredible polyrhythms and polyphonic stuff going on as well. And then I've got it here. That's behind me. I then got my little trusty Analog 4 from Electron. That can create polyrhythms with its really very powerful sequencer it's got on board. It's got 4 analog voices, and you can control 2 other pieces of hardware with CV. You can get an awful lot of mileage out of a little box like that. It might not have the Moog filter in it, but the alternatives out there for doing what this the end results that this can create are immense. So, we haven't even talked about using a DAW, which is, the most powerful sequencer of all. But there is something rather nice about a little standalone desktop instrument, one where you just twiddle with some controls and get some results. It's very immediate, it's very enjoyable, it's very addictive. I mean, after I'd played around and recorded those diary segments, I basically put this thing away. I got other stuff that I needed to do, and I hadn't touched this for about a week. And I came back to it yesterday, got it out of its box, because I wanted to just record just a few little bits of extra video segment for this video I'm putting together now. And so I hadn't played around with it for a week, and I got it out and sat down with it, and I just lost 2 hours of my life, just totally immersed in it again, just loving it again. So, I mean, will I keep it? I don't know for sure, actually. As much as I'm enjoying it, I'm not a hardware sequencer guy. I'm really attached to my DAW and my PC, and that's how I compose my music. So I don't know if it's really going to fit in my setup in the long term. I'd have to really sort of like keep coming back to it and trying, and I'm quite lazy. So I don't know if that'll happen, but I'm trying to keep open-minded about it. I'm in no hurry to sell it. It is an incredibly fascinating and creative tool. It's not going to be for everybody, but it might just be for you. It might just be the thing that really kicks off your creativity, gives you huge truckloads of it, because any instrument that can get you creative, get you creating music, writing music, playing music, and that's got to be a bonus, right? So I think it's a serious big thumbs up from me for this little box. It's a big shame about the bug. I'd like that fixed. I'd like to see a firmware update. But other than that, a big thumbs up. So until the next video, as always, thank you very, very much for watching.